Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Tudors, episode 109. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger, and I'm so glad that you could join me. As always, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the wonderful listeners who continue to support this podcast via Podbean Patron, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. This really does make a difference. If you love the podcast and tune into every episode, perhaps you'd consider becoming a Talking Tudors patron. It's easy to do. Just click on the Be My Patron on Podbean badge on the homepage of my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, or click on the Be a Patron button on the Podbean app. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll be automatically entered into our patron-only monthly giveaways. May's prize is a book pack consisting of book 1 and 2 of Wendy J. Dunn's Falling Pomegranate Seeds series, The Duty of Daughters and All Manner of Things. A huge thank you to the author for sponsoring this amazing prize. Now, on to today's episode. I'm excited that joining me on the show to talk about Tudor gems and jewellery is Justin K Prim. Justin is an American lapidary and gemologist living and working in Bangkok, Thailand. He has studied gem cutting traditions all over the world and is currently working on a book about the worldwide history of gemstone faceting, and has recently submitted a paper for publishing on the history of gem cutting in London. This includes an interesting section on the Tudor gem and jewellery trade. He works as a lapidary instructor for the Institute of Gem Trading, as well as writing articles, producing videos, and giving talks about gem cutting history. Our conversation's coming up straight after this short music break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. welcome to Talking Tudors. Justin, how are you?
Thank you. I'm doing very well. It's just turning into the rainy season here in Bangkok, so we've gone from very hot to pretty comfortable.
So let's start by you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about your background.
Okay, my name is Justin Prim. I'm an American gem cutter, and I've been living in Bangkok for the last 4 years, kind of having steeped myself into the world of the gem trade and gemstone cutting. I started gem cutting right around the time that I turned 30. I was in California, and I learned how to do gem cutting, and then that led me to going to school in Thailand because there's such a big gemstone trading community here. And right after I moved here, I started doing basically a kind of like I guess what will become a lifelong research project about the history of gem cutting. And I've just kind of been going ever since. And my love of history and my love of art and also my love of British culture has pushed me a little bit into this funny rabbit hole of Tudor art and Tudor jewelry. And yeah, so I've been thinking about that a lot in the last year.
Fantastic. Well, I know a lot of people love, obviously, Tudor art and Tudor jewelry, just magnificent stuff. So let's dive straight in. So, how important were gems and jewelry at the Tudor court?
I would say they were pretty important. I know both Henry and Elizabeth, they loved gems, they loved jewels. We can tell this not only, by seeing jewels and gems in paintings, but also just kind of looking at some of the things that were going on at the time. Like, for instance, Henry VIII had reserved the right of first sight on all jewels that were brought into the country. So basically he said, I want first dibs. If anything cool that comes in, I have the chance to buy it before anybody else gets to. And because of that, a lot of foreign artists and foreign, jewelers and gem cutters and goldsmiths, they wanted to be here. And we can see even by like immigration records and stuff that a lot of foreign jewelers and foreign gem cutters were coming into London at that time, especially because they knew it was such a lucrative place to be. It's like if you have a king or a queen who really wants the best, most interesting stuff, you should be there. You'll make money.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like such a Henry thing to do, to want first dibs on the best jewels, that's for sure. So, how did these gems actually get to London?
Good question. When we think about, what we call today like the British Empire, this was really starting in Elizabeth's time, before the middle of the 1500s into right at the beginning of the 1600s, there weren't really any British seafaring trading companies. Like all of what became the foundations of the British Empire started around 1550s, for about 50 years. So before that, all the trading that was coming from like the Far East was happening through Venice or through Portugal. These are, Venice already had been trading for like 700 years before Elizabeth came into power. So they were like the super traders of Europe, from the Silk Road and everything. And so once Britain had money really once they had this sort of ambition to try and cut out the middleman, they started building up, like the Muscovy Company and some of the other, there's two or three really large trading companies. And so one of the things that they were trading, of course, spices and textiles, but gemstones. They knew that they could go east, and then also as they discovered the Americas, they had emeralds and stuff coming in from the Americas. And so that's partially why England starts to become kind of wealthy and powerful. Before that, they were, at least in my opinion, they were like chasing the rest of Europe as far as trade power goes. And so once they had their own trading companies going and England starts importing a lot of stuff, we start to see more and more gems coming directly into London instead of coming into Portugal or into Venice or wherever else they were going into. And so as they would come in, the trading district of London was Cheapside. That was the medieval and Tudor jewelers district. And even today, like Cheapside isn't there anymore, but there still is Cheapside Road in London, and you can go there and see, you can't really see too much because it's pretty modern. But today, what used to be the giant, basically almost like the mall, it wasn't really a mall, but we could kind of think of it as the shopping center of that time for jewelry. Today, it's like a big office building down the street from St. Mary Le Beau Church. But at that time, in the early 1500s and on really until the Great Fire, that was the center of the gem trade for London. And I found one quote because I was doing research on this last year, and I found a great quote from the early 1500s. So this Italian traveler was in London, and he remarked that the Cheapside Street was one of the most remarkable things that he'd seen in London. He's comparing it to the shops of Milan and Rome and Venice and Florence, and he said he didn't think that the magnificence of London could be found in those other places. So really he's saying it's really one of the best and most sort of opulent places that you could go to buy luxury items. And it wasn't just gems and jewels. Of course, they were importing textiles, and they had furs, and if you could afford it, of course. But so yeah, Cheapside was kind of the center, and all the goldsmiths were there, gem cutters were there, anybody who was associated with that trade. And so if you were coming in from a trading company, you could then do business with those merchants, and then the customers would go to those merchants as well. So that was kind of the middle person to be at. And so all the shops were kind of like along the street, no windows. So everything's kind of just shutters that would open. And then, all of the shops would be identified by signs above the shop. So they had stuff like the White Lion and the Phoenix and the Green Dragon, this sort of almost like what we think of as like medieval style shop names. But that was really what was going on even in the Tudor period. And, you can kind of imagine, like, if you're in the goldsmith shop and you've got like the sound of people like kind of hammering a little bit on gold and silver, and you've got the sound of the carts going by because the windows are all open, and of course they want everyone to see into the shops and try to want to buy some of whatever they're selling. And then you've got some sound somewhere of like the gem cutter who's kind of like cranking away on their machine, just grinding down all of these stones that are coming in from all over the place. So they had sapphires, rubies, and diamonds coming in from India. They had rubies and spinels coming in from modern-day Burma, lapis and spinel coming from Afghanistan, and even some stuff that was more local, like they were getting pearls from Scotland, so that was like one of the major pearling places of that time. Opals were coming from Hungary, and of course garnets were coming from Bohemia. And garnets had been very famous and popular, even since the early medieval times, like the Dark Age periods. We still find, like the Sutton Hoo. All the Sutton Hoo stuff is full of Czech garnets. So they definitely had that. So yeah, lots of stuff. It was a rich time. They almost had as many choices as we have today for what they could put into a jewel.
Yeah, that was fascinating, Justin. I love the snapshot of Tudor Cheapside and that anecdote by that visitor. I love all the travel diaries. I collect them whenever possible, and I find them online, and they are wonderful contemporary descriptions of Tudor London. So that was really cool. I really enjoyed that. So obviously, if we look at any portrait of, Tudor nobility or royalty, there is an abundance of jewels there and jewellery to marvel at. So were they actually cutting the stones? And you've kind of touched a little bit when you were describing the sounds and the noises, but were they cutting them in London, or were they already cut when they arrived, or was it a mixture of both?
It was a mixture of both, and it changed over the period. At the beginning of the Tudor period, I would say like there weren't really any gem cutters yet in London. Like I found one reference that said in 1501, most of the gem cutting was done outside of London. But I think probably we have Henry VIII to thank for what's about to happen, because of his love of, opulent luxury stuff. All these craftsmen were coming in from all over Europe, and they just stayed there. Like they would resettle in London, they would set up a shop, they would try to peddle their wares, and some of them obviously were more successful than others. But even the ones that weren't specifically doing business with the court or with the king specifically, of course, there's a whole court of people that also want to look the part, and be to that status level. And then even regular people, not like lower class people, but like some middle class people also kind of played that social game a little bit. And so there were a lot of different customers. And so, yeah, as the period goes on, we start to see, records of different people coming into London. And I think between like 1570 and 1590, there's a record of at least 138 immigrants coming in, specifically around the gem and jewelry trade. And I know for certain 19 of them were gem cutters, because they're labeled by like what kind of specialty they had. So some people were just doing agates, and some were diamond cutters, and some they were just calling stone cutters. So a lot of them were coming, well, I mean, if we have a bit of a bigger understanding of the gem trade at that time, it's not really surprising where they're coming from. They're coming from the other major centers. So Germany was a very old gem cutting center, and so like Nuremberg and Augsburg specifically had people coming to London. Lots of people from Belgium, and of course Belgium later became the biggest diamond importer into the world. A lot of Dutch, well, obviously Dutch and Belgium at that time were kind of the same Low Countries thing, but you know, a lot of those people were already trading in gems, and so they had an established craft set up there, and some as well from France and Spain. So there's lots of styles coming in, lots of different opinions about what is a good cut or what is a good style of jewelry. And when these foreigners come in, they bring their skills, they bring their cultural preferences that are probably not exactly the same as Londoners or as, you know, French to German or whatever. So yeah, and they would set up, and then over time they'd start taking on apprentices because they of course needed help. And then that was sort of just the way, you know, the goldsmiths had their apprenticeship system under the Goldsmiths Guild, and then the gem cutters had their sort of self-regulated apprenticeships that were not really under the watchful eye of the Goldsmiths Guild, but still sort of under the regulations, because the Goldsmiths Guild was really, they controlled everything at that time. You know, they said everyone must be in Cheapside, and you know, we don't want anybody else doing gem trading or jewelry outside of where we can look and regulate. You know, we see a lot of people in Cheapside even living above the shops and kind of just going downstairs and setting up shop in the morning. And so then people would do these apprenticeships maybe around 14 years old, and they would be like 6 or 7 years. Like, they're pretty long apprenticeships. And some of the people that were doing them, they weren't just gem cutters or weren't just jewelers. You know, even a lot of the master painters that we know of their works today, they apprenticed as goldsmiths. And so it's not really surprising. Like, for me, I look at a lot at Tudor paintings and Renaissance paintings for, you know, try to understand what was the style at that time. And it's not surprising to me at all to see that, you know, when you look at the paintings, as you said, they're full of jewelry, but they're very specific. You know, they're very accurate. You know, for the few pieces of Tudor jewelry that we have, we can see that they're pretty almost photorealistic, some of them, depending on the artist, but, you know, really good depictions of not just the gold, but the cuts, you know. And for me as a gem cutter, I can look at them and I know exactly what cuts they're using. You know, I know what cuts are in style at that time, and they're all there in the paintings. You know, they're completely revealed if you're looking at the close-up details. So it's pretty fun for me at least, and I know for you as well, to look at these old paintings and find all the secrets that they've hidden in there, whether symbolic or actual literal pieces.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's a very timely discussion, actually, because I was just doing some research for another talk I'm doing about Nicholas Hilliard. And of course, he's best known as, you know, this incredible miniaturist, or limner, if you want to use the language of the day. But he was, of course, he was a goldsmith himself, and was from a family of goldsmiths, his father, his grandfather, and I don't know how way back it goes. So it's really interesting to know that they weren't just goldsmiths, they could be artists as well, like he was. I want to hear a little bit more about the actual goldsmiths who were making these incredible objects. Obviously, some were coming overseas, some like Hilliard, he was born in Exeter. So tell us a little bit more about the goldsmiths.
Yeah, so the goldsmiths were also, you know, with the gem cutters and the merchants, they're all there in Cheapside together. And the goldsmiths were really well organized. I mean, they had a guild, they had a livery company. So they were really one of the first of, you know, maybe, I think, 13 livery companies that had, you know, the charter of the king to be able to do business. And so their charter goes all the way back to, I think, the 1320s. And, you know, and I've looked at some of those. They have the record books still going back to the 1320s. They're all handwritten and very hard to read now, but it's amazing what still exists. But so they were very strict about rules. If it's gold, it must be gold, and we're gonna test it. You know, no synthetic gemstones, no fakes. And of course, people would always break the rules, and then they would go around and find them every year. And so yeah, some of the people were coming from Europe, and the same with the gem cutting. Their styles were meshing with what was already going on in England and what had already been going on, you know, since even medieval times. One of the interesting things is, you know, a lot of times there'll be a difference between like a designer and the actual craftsman himself. Like, for instance, Hans Holbein the Younger, I think we mostly think of him as a painter, or like a designer at least, and he's got a book that I think was made after he died. That's just the jewelry book. And if you go through the book, it's full of all these different designs, and they're really well rendered. That you can see what kind of stones he's using and pearls and the kind of gold work. And we can get an idea about the styles of the time and what was popular. And he's left a lot of stuff, and specifically he was doing a lot of stuff for Henry VIII. He was designing jewels that Henry was giving as gifts, and sometimes there'd be like interlocking initials, and even some of the pieces that I don't think they still exist, but at least some of the pieces that are in the jewelry book have mystery initials, initials of people that we're not exactly sure who is he giving this to. So he was obviously, we know he was having a lot of affairs, and he was having fun, and he was giving a lot of gifts, personalized gifts. And so Hans Holbein was one of the people that was designing that stuff. If we just want to think about the jewelry of the time and the people making it, they're looking at the world around them, and they're making stuff as status symbols. So it's not, I would say it's not necessarily so different than today. If you want to go and dress up, you're going to put on extra layers and a nice outfit and some rings or some earrings or whatever it is. And we see a lot of that, at least in the paintings, and some of the stuff that has still survived. Sadly, not much has. They had this habit of recycling everything and reusing everything, and that wasn't really a Tudor thing necessarily. That continued on. Even when we look at more modern paintings, like even all the way up to like the 1800s, we can find paintings of people at different coronations, and in the V&A they've got painting, and you can see all the jewels, and the jewels are in the V&A still, some of them, but they don't look exactly the same. They've reworked them, they've reset them, and so they were always doing this. Even for instance, the crowns, they would rework them for each monarch. And of course, when Elizabeth came, Henry's crown's not going to fit on Elizabeth's head, so they're going to rework it and maybe use the same jewels or maybe use different jewels depending on what they have at the time and who's the goldsmith and everything like that. So it's quite fascinating. And when we look at, like, especially like some of Holbein's jewelry designs, we can really get a sense, because they're in color, and you can really get a sense of what was popular, and some of these different ways of like working letters into the thing. When we think about Anne Boleyn's iconic bee necklace, I actually don't know the story behind that. Maybe you do, but it's not that unusual to, I think, have some letters integrated into a jewelry, sometimes more obviously, and sometimes a little bit more subtly, but they liked their symbolism in there.
Absolutely. Yeah, they loved doing the initials and the intertwined initials, one of their favorites. So I'd love to hear about one of your favorite pieces. There are bits, you've said a lot has been lost, unfortunately. A lot was recycled and changed, so we probably wouldn't even know that some of the gems are still, in a certain piece that came from something else. But some does survive. So what's a favorite of yours that's a Tudor jewelry?
I think for me, I was thinking about this a lot. I think my absolute favorite it's a pendant. And I'm really like a ring guy. I love rings. And I always am looking for an awesome Tudor ring. But actually, the thing that really has caught my eye, there's a pendant in the V&A. It's a gold kind of double jewel pendant. So there's a peridot, there's a garnet, and then there's a sapphire bead hanging from the bottom. And there's a few reasons why I really like this pendant. One, as a gem cutter, I look at the gems and they're very big, they're very visible, and they're cut in a really weird way. We have a general idea about what were the styles of gem cutting at that time, but it's a very much evolving art, especially then. Faceting was very new starting in the 1400s. In the 1500s, it was still very new. And some of the designs in the cutting style of this pendant, I've just really not seen before. But the other interesting thing about it, so the way that the setting is done, the setting is open in the back. So as you wear it on your necklace, the gems are touching your skin. And so this kind of goes into this whole other idea of like that gems have a sort of divine magical power that will help to protect you from different things. And, this idea is pretty old, but not only did they leave the backs open, and it's obviously very intentional, because they also engraved almost what we would now maybe call like magic words into the back of the setting in Latin. And so there's two different ones. One of them is, if I can pronounce this correct, Anani Sapta Dei, which evidently was a very common invocation for warding off epilepsy. So this is around the back of the top gem, and then around the back of the bottom gem it says Tetragrammata, which is kind of like a alteration of the Tetragrammaton, which is an invocation of God. You know, they're invoking God and Mary and Jesus again for protection. So they've kind of got the gemstones in there for protection, and then they've got engraved in the back, God, please prevent me from getting epilepsy or whatever else they were worried about. So for me, that one is it's so cool, and you can go see it. It's in the V&A. It's on display. So I've seen it like 3 times, and every time I'm just like, wow, okay, this is, you know, it's pretty big too. So it's easy to appreciate.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll have to get a photo of it so I can share with our listeners. And I love that it's got those engravings on the back. That's really interesting. And I just want to look a little deeper about something you just said there, which was those sayings on the back and the fact of it being on the skin and those ideas around the powers, I suppose, that gems could have. So what about the superstitions around gemstones? Was this a medieval idea, or did people in Tudor times also believe that gemstones held, let's call them, magical powers?
Yeah, I mean, the thought of magical powers it's quite old. I mean, really, we can go back to the earliest books about stones, which is thousands of years maybe, but it was definitely popular in medieval times, and it really didn't fall out of favor in Tudor times. I mean, you know, we think about the Tudor period as like a time of religious change, right? The Catholic connection is being broken and the Church of England is getting formed, but the fact that we're kind of coming out of a Catholic worldview, if we think about the Catholicism at the time, it was full of probably what we today consider like strange rituals and rites. You know, they were doing stuff back then that we don't really still do today. And they were kind of like Tudor medicine or Renaissance medicine. It's not very good compared to, you know, their concept of it doesn't really make too much sense by today's standards. And the same thing when it comes to like superstition. You know, they were kind of under this idea that there were angels and demons around them all the time, and that they needed to be praying. You know, like we know about these books of hours. I think Anne Boleyn has a book of hours that still exists somewhere, and so people were praying at all these different hours, really to kind of keep demons away and keep themselves sort of pure, so they wouldn't want to do bad things. The superstition of stones was there as well. It had been there. It stayed. I mean, it really stayed all the way until probably the 1700s in England, when, you know, we sort of have the Enlightenment and stuff, and science really is kind of picking up some steam. But so yeah, lots of people thought that different gemstones would do different things. You know, some would protect you from snakes, some would protect you from poison, some would protect you from, I don't know, well, epilepsy, you know, as we just saw from that other one. One of the big things that people were really scared about was poison. There was a few different remedies that they would prescribe for poison. One of my favorite ones, well, there was a few. Sometimes they would use ruby, and sometimes they would use emeralds. Sometimes they would do all different things, and they would do different things with them. Sometimes it was okay to just wear them in the necklace, like the one I was just speaking about. But sometimes they actually wanted to grind it up and put it into water or put it into food, like modern medicine today. They really thought gemstones were a medicine from the divine to bring almost like divinity into us. One of my favorite examples of that idea is Bezoar stones. So there's lots of Bezoar stones. I mean, maybe if you've never heard of a Bezoar stone, it sounds really rare, but when you go into museums of Renaissance artifacts and Tudor artifacts, there are actually lots of Bezoars. And so the Bezoar is kind of like, you know, we know about in humans like kidney stones and gallbladder stones, you know, this unpleasant thing that we don't really like, and animals have those too. So they would find these basically calcium deposits inside of a dead animal. You know, they'd slaughter them, and then inside of the, you know, whatever part of the body those come out of, they'd find these little stones, and they thought that they were an antidote against poison. Elizabeth actually had one, and there's a record of it. I don't think it still exists, but they describe it as it's like a small stone hanging on a gold chain that's on a bracelet. So basically she could, I don't know if she was wearing it a lot, but, you know, if you think about sitting down at dinner and you could put a little bit in your drink, you could maybe dip the entire thing in your drink, which I know that was a popular way. But the description of this Bezoar setting said that the stone was partially spent, meaning they had been kind of like grinding it off a little bit. So maybe, you know, like nutmeg, you would grind it off over your drink, and, you know, then you could have wine and for sure there was no poison. The coolest thing about the bezoar for me, though, is actually modern scientists have studied bezoars and found out that actually they are an antidote against certain types of poison. So this wasn't actually, most of the other ones were superstition, but in the case of the bezoar, when you dissolve it into something that has arsenic inside of it, the arsenic is removed, or I don't know if it's dissolved or just deactivated, but it was actually true. You can actually neutralize poisons with the bezoar. And then the other funny thing with the bezoar, for anybody who's ever seen Harry Potter, that's probably the most famous bezoar in history, when Ron drinks the love potion and then he ends up trying to drink the antidote to the love potion and gets poisoned. And then, Harry's like going through the drawers looking for the stone, and he sticks the stone in Ron's mouth and he neutralizes the poison. That's what that was. So even Queen Elizabeth had one of those in her medicinal cabinet somewhere, and was using it pretty regularly.
That's really cool, thinking of Elizabeth sitting at dinner and checking with her bracelet. That's really interesting. So it's not like a prevention. That one's more like a neutralizing, because I know they had other things like a detecting.
I think they were using diamonds.
Oh, were they? Right. I think I've heard of unicorn horn. That wasn't obviously unicorn horn, but it was narwhal or something that they thought also had a kind of detecting power. So they were obviously using a few different things: detect, neutralize. That's really
really whatever. And you think about the culture of that time. Is if Elizabeth dies, it's a big deal. So anything that they can do, whether it's astrology, because they were definitely doing astrology, and John Dee and all that. And trying to find the right day to do different things on with a magical or divine, however you want to put it, but it's basically a magical day or a magical tool. Whatever you can use it, because just in case.
Now, I know, Justin, that you've got an exciting article being published soon. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's kind of how this little rabbit hole started for me as far as the Tudor stuff goes. I had this idea already that I wanted to kind of understand the history of gem cutting in London. And I went there. I've been there lots of times, but in 2018, I got to go and meet a couple of really old gem cutters, like 70 plus years old, who are still using almost like Victorian era technology, like these hand crank machines that don't use electricity. And so I got so excited from meeting those guys. I was like, I must go back and do research, and I was able to get a grant from the Society of Antiquaries in London to go back for 2 months. So in 2019, I got to spend 2 months in England and not have to worry about the financial side of it. And so I was going through, all the museums in London. I went up to the Midlands and was checking out some of the stuff up there. I went up to Whitby, which is another kind of important gemstone locality where all the jet was coming from at that time, or really of all the times. And so I wrote this 30-page article. It's really just like a story of gem cutting in England from the 12th century all the way until today. So it's quite in-depth. It's about 30 pages. And so I was able to submit it to the Journal of Gemology in London, and we're just finishing up the peer review process now. But they've told me that it's going to get published in 2 parts sometime before the end of the year. So if anybody's looking at the Journal of Gemology and wants to know more about gem cutting and jewelry in London, there's going to be a 2-parter. It's pretty cool because normally they don't do 2-part articles. So I was like, it's 30 pages. Can we do 2? And they said, okay, that's pretty cool. It's a cool story. So, and nobody really knows about it. So it's quite fun. And there's a good bit about the Tudor period in there. There's a whole sort of sub chapter where I just talk about the 1500s up to the 1600s and what was going on and the technology that they had at that time and stuff like that. So it's, for me at least, it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And how cool to get to spend 2 months just researching something that you love and that you're interested in. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a dream trip for sure.
Yeah, and just in time, hey, before everything locked down. That was lucky.
Yes. I'm just like, wow, okay, if I would have waited 6 more months, I don't think I could have done that.
So in general, if people would just want to find out a little bit more about you and about your work, where can they go?
I've got a bunch of articles on my website that are basically gem and jewelry history oriented. So that's just my name, justinkprim.com. And since COVID started, I've been really focusing on videos because I'm also stuck at home like everybody else. So if you go to facetinghistory.com, it'll take you to all my videos and stuff. And then Instagram, my name again, Justin K Prim. I'm regularly looking at paintings and jewelry and posting them on there, vintage antique stuff all the way back to Renaissance times. So I'm kind of like posting modern and old stuff as well. So if people are interested in jewelry history, they might find that interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll put links to those in our show notes. Now, I think you've heard some episodes of Talking Tudors before, Justin, but at the end, when I have guests on for the first time, I like to do what I call a little game of 10 to go. So this is just 10 quick questions to get to know you a little bit better. So are you ready for that?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right. So if you could visit anywhere in the world right now, where would you go and why?
Definitely would be Venice. I've never been to Venice. It's been on the top of my list for a few years. As a historian, I really want to check out the history of the art and the history of the gems in Venice, but also I just think it must be a beautiful place. And I heard since COVID started, like all the dolphins came back into Venice because they're not going on the canals anymore. So I think if I could go during COVID, I would. That would be a perfect time when nobody else is there, and just walk around Venice and imagine that I'm in the 1400s or whatever.
Yeah, that would be so cool, actually, because normally it's so hard to get any photos without, throngs of people. So that would be awesome. And you sound like a pretty talented guy, but what if you wanted to learn a new skill, or maybe you've got your eye on something, what would it be?
Actually, yeah, I really want to learn 3D modeling. I'm looking at a lot of old technology, old machines and stuff from the Renaissance and even like late medieval. These are things that don't exist anymore other than in drawings. I'd love to be able to three-dimensionally animate them and make some videos just to show people, this is how they could cut gems. Like in Tudor times, what were they using? We don't have that anymore, but we know what it is. If I could just make a video of this hand cranking guy, but that's it's a lot of work to learn that. So I might just subcontract that to somebody else.
Yeah, and I do love any sort of reconstruction. I'm a huge fan when they reconstruct the, palaces that are now gone, all that sort of thing. I think not all of us can visualize as well as others, so that's really helpful.
Yeah.
And what about books? What's your favorite genre of books?
I am definitely a lover of sci-fi and fantasy, and I usually try and alternate if I can between fiction and nonfiction. So because I'm cutting a lot. I'm a gem cutter by trade, so I'm listening to a lot of audiobooks. So I usually get my fantasy fill on audiobooks, and then at night I've got like real books or a Kindle, and so I'm going through more research, sort of scholarly research stuff and stuff that I'm looking at for my own research book and stuff like that. So yeah, history obviously, but yeah, I'm a pretty big fantasy fan as well.
Awesome. And what do you do when you're not gem cutting to relax and unwind?
Well, I would have said before traveling. I was traveling a lot, but I think no one's traveling now.
No.
Since COVID started, we have started maybe an unhealthy addiction with Mario Kart. So my wife and I we have the projector set up, and we can play on the computer, and we've just been battling for the last year on Mario Kart, just to wind down at night.
Yeah, that sounds like fun. And what movie or show have you watched more than once?
Well, to keep it Tudor related, I really love both of the Queen Elizabeth movies. The first one and Reign of Power. Those ones are fun. I don't know. I think they're vaguely historically accurate, but they're definitely fun, just to get into the mood. And I've definitely watched both of those like at least 3 times. I'm also really interested in costuming. I don't really do it too much because I'm not so good, but sometimes I just like to look at least other people's ideas of what the costumes look like and, get a sense for how it all came together with the jewelry and stuff like that.
Justin, if you didn't need to sleep at night, what would you do with all that extra time?
I'm not sleeping in that much
Okay.
much at all anyway, but no, mostly I'm just completely entranced by the research that I've been doing. I mean, COVID's really put me into such a deeper space to just not be bothered with the outside world and just go super deep into the research. So I'm trying to finish up a couple of books, and then I finished up that research paper for the London project. But yeah, most of the time when I'm not working, I'm staying up late at night, going into like archive.org and looking at old books and whatever I can get my hands on from a distance. And I just can't get enough. So it's a really nerdy lifestyle.
No, I love it. And that's good to hear, because obviously some people have gone the opposite, which is just being too distracted by what's going on to be able to dive into their research. So I'm glad to hear that it's going well for you. That's excellent. Justin, name a person that inspires you. It can be someone from the past or someone current, contemporary, and why.
Well, I guess I'll keep it personal and say I've been very lucky to have a lot of really great mentors in my industry. And when I moved to Bangkok, I befriended a lot of people that were already very much deep into the world of research and professional work. And some of those mentors who have already written a lot of books have really helped me to improve my work and just get comfortable being in another country and in a new trade, because I wasn't in this trade before 5 or 6 years ago. So really my mentors are constantly personally inspiring me, like every week. And usually when I make a dumb mistake, like I put up a dumb YouTube video, and then one of them will email me and say, you need to really take that down, you made a big mistake, redo it and then put it back. And I'm like, okay, thank you, you've saved me being embarrassed by too many people.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think a mentor, in regardless of what you're doing or researching or what work you're doing, is so important, isn't it? I found that even just in the world of history that I'm in, got some really fantastic women mentors, and they're just so inspiring, and they, make you want to work harder and achieve more things. So it's fantastic. And that kind of
Yeah.
links nicely to the next thing I want to ask you, which is, what's a really great piece of advice? You've given us one there, but what's a really great piece of advice that you've received that you're willing to share with us?
I guess the favorite thing that my main mentor told me, speaking about research and like how to work relevantly, he said, writing something original means you need to figure out, where does knowledge end? You need to read everything that's ever been written about whatever you're trying to talk about. You figure out where the end of that thing is, and then you go to the next step. And I always think about that. I think about all the books that I've got on my shelf and what's not in them. And then that's how I've kind of figured out the book that I wanted to work on. And I said, okay, nobody's talking about the history of colored stones. There's books about diamonds, there's books about jewelry, but you want to understand like sapphires in the world of the Tudors or whatever. There's very few books, and those ones are great, but there's still so much more that hasn't been said. That was a great advice for me because it showed me where I needed to go.
So just a question that's just popped into my head because of what you said. Are you working on a book at the moment? Is that what you're also doing?
Yeah. I've been working on this for 4 years, and I think it's almost done. I mean, I thought it was done when COVID started, and then I stopped working on it for a while, and it's just about there. I just have a couple little research trips I need to do to France, because there's just a little gap in the end of the story. But yeah, it's basically an overview of the history of gem cutting from about 1380 until today, just in Europe, but it goes country by country and just looks at how it all happened, basically. And yeah, I'm just missing this last little bit of the story, and I can't finish it without that. But I
Oh,
need to
yeah.
go. Sometimes people just don't want a Zoom call. You need to go there. If you don't know them very well, you need to go there. And right now, it's not possible. So yeah.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
maybe in
well,
a
that's
year,
exciting. Yeah.
your listeners they'll see a book somewhere, and it'll be that book. But yeah, still in the works.
Fantastic. Well, that sounds exciting. And lucky last question. What's something that you're looking forward to in the near future? That's one. What's another thing?
Travel, definitely travel. Like, I am itching to go back to, now I'm really looking at America and American history of cutting. And I've got this whole trip in sort of New England planned out,
Oh,
and I'm just waiting for the COVID restrictions and to be safe. I don't want to just be
yeah. Yeah.
going around all crazy. But now that there's some vaccines, I cannot wait to get out of Thailand and just get back into the primary research and just meeting people.
Yeah.
I'm sure we all feel the same. You haven't seen too many people in the last year, so I'll be happy to get out and see that.
Now, the very, very, very last thing that I like to ask my guests is for a Tudor takeaway. So, this is something for our listeners to go and have a look at after the episode. Sometimes people give book suggestions, movies to watch, songs to listen to. Do you have a Tudor takeaway for us?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple. Well, I mentioned already that Peridot and Garnet pendant, so you can actually go
Yes.
check that out now. It's on the V&A website. I think if you just type in Peridot and Garnet pendant, it might pop up, but the number is M242 1975. So I think if you type that in, it will pop
Great.
up. But as far as books go, there's a couple that there's one that I really like, and then there's one new one that just came out, so I'll share. One of them is called The Cheapside Hoard. So The Cheapside Hoard is a little bit later than Tudor. Some of the stuff in there could be Tudor, but the book is really great. It's all about how they found this sort of early 1600s treasure chest, basically under a floor in Cheapside in London, and it basically sat there since They don't really know, but probably the early 1600s. And it has like over 1,000 items, gold, jewelry, unset gems. And the book is great. It's written by the curator of the Museum of London. And they actually did an exhibition of it some years ago. And I think it's supposed to come back. It's only ever been exhibited once, which is crazy because it's probably the greatest, next to Sutton Hoo, it's probably one of the greatest things that's ever been found in England, and it's never been on display other than once. So they told me they're building a whole new museum, and when that museum comes, it's going to have its own space. But for now, you can't see any of it, which is crazy. So you should get the book, London's Lost Jewels. There's lots of really nice photos. And then there's a new one that just came out, and I've only skimmed it, but it's brand new. It's called A Marvel to Behold by Timothy Schroeder, and the subtitle is Gold and Silver at the Court of Henry VIII. So I haven't read it yet, but it looks to be really cool. It's a pretty big book. It's not so much about jewelry, but more like gold plate and silver plate, but it does overlap into the world of goldsmithing and jewelry. So
who was the author, Justin?
Timothy Schroeder. I just saw a book review of it in the Jewelry History Today newsletter, and I was like, oh, what is this? Tudor gold? I am thinking a lot about Tudor gold right now. Let's just check it out. So I ordered it, so we'll see. But that might be an interesting one if you want to read something that's really just come out.
That's fantastic. To be honest, I had not heard of that one. So I'm immediately, every time I record an episode, I end up adding to, I say, I'm not buying any more books this week. I'm not buying any more books. And then I end up buying another book. So that's great. Anyway, all good. That's fantastic.
Don't feel bad.
Sorry.
I just bought like 20 books and sent them to my mom, and then she's going to resend them to me. So I definitely feel your
That's
addiction.
A lot. I've never bought 20, I don't think, at the same time. So that's a record to work up to, I think.
Some of them are really small, so they're not like full-size books, but some of them are full-size books, but they're all old. They're all like from the 30s and 40s. So I'm like looking for my primary sources.
Yeah, and I love old books because you never know. I posted something about a book I bought that had an inscription in it, which I love when they've got little messages, but then it also had like newspaper articles and other cool stuff. And then someone told me that there's a book, now I can't remember the title, but you might like this, about all the interesting things that have been found inside of books. So I was oh my God, there's no end to it.
The other thing I really love with old books, when you get really, like if you go into the British Library, and you can look at some of the really old books, they've got such an interesting smell. They have this it's because it's not paper, it's basically animal products, and it has such a unique smell. I love the smell of really old books. It's so unique.
Well, Justin, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking Tudors with us.
Well, thanks for having me. I've been enjoying your podcast while I cut, so it'll be kind of funny to be on the other side of it.
You can listen to yourself. That sounds great. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.